Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when we talk about power, what usually comes to mind? Maybe a president in the Oval Office, perhaps. A monarch on a throne, or, I don't know, even a big corporation. It feels like something a few people have and others don't.
Right.
But what if that idea is actually quite limited, maybe even a bit misleading?
It's a great question to start with because, yeah, those traditional views of power, they often fall short.
How so?
Well, they tend to focus so much on who holds the reins, or where power is centralized, like in the state or a single ruler.
Okay.
And they really miss the much more pervasive, subtle ways power actually operates every single day, right under our noses sometimes.
And that's exactly where Michel Foucault comes in, this 20th century French philosopher. He just completely shook up how we think about power.
Absolutely. He moved beyond just seeing it as like simple repression or a top-down command structure.
He showed us it's far more intricate, deeply embedded, and often incredibly, well, surprising in its effects.
Yeah, and our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack Foucault's unique way of looking at power. We'll explore three distinct yet interconnected mechanisms he identified: sovereign power, disciplinary power, and what he called biopower.
Sovereign, disciplinary, and biopower. Got it.
And the goal isn't just to, understand these concepts academically, but to illuminate how they've shaped societies, especially in the West, from maybe the 17th century onwards.
And crucially, how they continue to operate today, right? Often in ways that directly impact you, the listener.
Exactly, in ways you might not even realize.
Okay, so let's dive into this radical approach Foucault took. He challenged the very notion that power is something one possesses, like property, or that it lives solely in the state. So how did he envision it? What was his big idea?
Well, he saw power not as a static thing, but as a dynamic relation of force. Or maybe think of it as an action upon an action.
An action upon an action. What does that mean practically?
Think of it like this. It's not about a boss having power over an employee, like it's a possession. It's more about the constant give and take, the subtle influences, the nudges that happen in their interaction.
Okay, so it's fluid, always shifting.
Precisely. It's constantly emerging through these interactions. It's not fixed.
That's a huge shift right there. So power isn't centralized then. It's not just at the top.
No, Foucault insisted power isn't centralized at all. Instead, he described it as an extensive, diffuse, dynamic, and capillary network.
Capillary network, like tiny blood vessels.
Exactly like that. Imagine power not as a few big, obvious rivers, but as countless tiny streams. An invisible capillary network that seeps into every corner of our lives.
Wow.
It literally gets into the very grain of individuals, touches their bodies, and inserts itself into their actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes, and everyday lives. It's everywhere, but often invisible.
Okay, but these power relations, they're almost always asymmetrical, right? They can involve violence.
Oh, absolutely. They can certainly involve violence, but, and this is key, they are never purely violent. Because, as Foucault said, where there is power, there is resistance.
Resistance, but not like a big revolution necessarily.
Not necessarily. This resistance isn't some external force coming in. It's local. It's inherent to the power network itself. It's not always some grand, unified rebellion, but maybe countless small acts of pushing back, questioning, refusing.
Right, I see.
And this leads to Foucault's micro-level approach. He wanted us to look at the microphysics of power.
The tiny details.
Yes, to unveil these often hidden techniques of domination. It's about understanding the subtle ways power shapes us, rather than just looking at the big, obvious displays of force, like a king ordering an execution.
This brings us to another crucial concept, power knowledge. Foucault argues that these two are co-constitutive. What does that mean for us? How does that work?
It means they're inseparable. They create each other. The exercise of power perpetually creates knowledge, and conversely, knowledge constantly induces effects of power.
So you can't have one without the other.
You simply can't. Think of it like this. The way we talk about, categorize, and study something that's producing knowledge, right? Foucault says this very knowledge creates new pathways, new ways for power to operate upon that thing. For example, the specific forms of knowledge produced by doctors about mental illness. Well, that gives them a certain kind of power to diagnose, categorize, and intervene in people's lives.
So it's not just that knowledge informs power, but that power itself generates the very things we come to see as knowledge. That sounds incredibly profound and maybe a little unsettling.
It absolutely is. It makes you question where our truths come from. Now, to really grasp how revolutionary Foucault's ideas were, we first need to understand the old guard, the traditional view of power he was pushing against. He called this sovereign power.
Okay, sovereign power.
Let's step back in time and see how it operated, primarily in ancient and classical eras.
This was the earliest form, right? The classic image of the king or emperor. It sounds like it was all about brute force and public displays.
You've basically got it. The key characteristic of sovereign power was the ruler's right to take life or let live.
A pretty absolute power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was primarily exercised through the sovereign's right to inflict death or allow life.
Hmm.
And this was often done publicly, brutally, designed to visibly demonstrate authority.
Like public executions.
Exactly. The focus was on the crime itself, and visible bodily punishment served as a symbolic reauthorization of the sovereign's power. Think about the guillotine, the spectacle of it all.
So very top-down and discontinuous, like power wasn't constantly felt but asserted in these big moments.
Yeah, precisely. Power was felt in those dramatic, often symbolic acts that reaffirmed the sovereign's authority. A stark example Foucault uses is the leper colony.
Ah, right. How does that fit?
Well, the disease were simply made to leave the city once infected. It was a clear exclusionary power, a simple levy on the diseased body showing a very clear us versus them, banishment, exclusion.
Got it. But then things started to change.
Yes. Around the 18th century, Foucault observed a significant shift. Society started moving away from these brutal public displays towards more subtle, institutionalized forms of power.
And this is where disciplinary power emerges.
Exactly. It's less about the king's acts and more about shaping behavior, training people.
So disciplinary power's focus isn't on brute coercion, but on the training of behavior. Its aim is to acquire obedience and organize the social body efficiently, economically. It trains both bodies and minds.
Mm-hmm.
And the perfect metaphor for this, the architectural model, is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, right?
The panopticon, yes. It's an architectural design for prisons.
Mm-hmm.
A central watchtower overlooking circular cells.
And the lighting is key.
Crucial. Backlighting ensures that the person in the tower can see into every cell, but the inmates can't see the observer.
Mm-hmm.
They never know if they're being watched at any given moment.
So the genius and the terror of it is its psychological effect.
Exactly. The inmate is induced in a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power.
You effectively police yourself because you could be watched at any moment.
Right. You internalize the surveillance.
It's incredibly efficient, terrifyingly so. It drastically reduces the need for many guards and constant direct force. But it also sounds, well, really dehumanizing.
Did Foucault see any positive aspects to this kind of power? Or was it always about control?
That's a really good question. Foucault was generally more interested in how power operates its mechanics, rather than judging it as inherently good or bad.
Okay.
He saw how this model, the panopticon principle, extended far beyond just prisons. He argued this type of control started being used in all institutions within society.
Like where?
Hospitals, schools, asylums, and even factories and army barracks. Anywhere you need to manage groups of people efficiently. It's about optimizing behavior, creating docile, useful bodies, which isn't inherently negative in all contexts, but the implications for individual autonomy are, well, profound.
So these panoptic practices, heavy regulation, constant surveillance, they're still very much alive in modern prisons today.
Very much so.
You hear inmates consistently report that the extreme lack of autonomy, even over basic choices like what to eat or when to sleep, is a severe deprivation.
Yeah, it's a constant theme.
This micromanaging, this constant surveillance, it seems designed to strip away individuality and make inmates just objects of information, not people.
And here's the crucial, often overlooked consequence. This loss of autonomy and self-image can lead to what's called institutionalization or prisonization.
Meaning what?
Meaning inmates become dependent on having choices made for them. They lose the ability to function autonomously.
Which must make life after release incredibly difficult.
Tragically, yes. This dependency often contributes to high rates of recidivism because these practices, by simply punishing and containing, they fail to address the underlying factors that actually lead to criminal behavior in the first place. The system isn't really geared toward a true rehabilitation in many cases, but a very specific kind of control and management.
Okay, so if sovereign power was about taking life or letting live, and disciplinary power was about controlling individual lives and bodies, training them, Foucault then introduces biopower.
Yes, the latest and what he called the utmost determinative power mechanism.
This emerged later, late 18th century.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
Coinciding with developments in the life sciences, statistics, biology.
Okay, so what's the fundamental shift here? How is biopower different?
The fundamental shift with biopower is from sovereign powers make die or let live
Yeah.
to actively make life live.
Make life live. That sounds positive.
It sounds positive, yes.
Yeah.
But paradoxically, it also involves letting die for the perceived greater good of the population.
Letting die. How does that work?
It's no longer just about the individual body, like in disciplinary power. It's about the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life at a collective level, the level of the population.
So a whole different scale. It looks at entire populations as a biological entity, a species.
Precisely. Focusing on factors like disease, hygiene, and sexuality, but also propagation, births, and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, all the vital statistics of a population.
So it's described as a positive and productive force. Punishment in this framework isn't just about retribution. It serves as a positive regulator to protect and maintain specific forms of life within that population.
Exactly. It's about optimizing the life of the population itself. Foucault identifies two poles, or maybe two levels, of biopower.
Okay.
First, there's anatomopolitics. This operates at the individual level, quite similar to disciplinary power, focusing on optimizing the body. Think of individualized healthcare fitness regimes.
Right, like the care you get from a doctor.
Yes. And second, there's biopolitics. This works at the collective level, managing the population as a distinct biological and political category, making decisions based on demographics, public health data, risk factors across groups.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. Can you give an example of this evolution? From sovereign to disciplinary to biopower.
Sure. Disease management is a great example. Think back to the leper colony. The diseased were simply expelled. That's sovereign power in action. Exclusion.
Right, just get rid of the problem.
Then you have something like managing the plague. Historically, plague-stricken towns implemented rigorous individual monitoring, strict quarantines, rules for movement, checking house by house. That's disciplinary power. Detailed control over individual bodies in space.
So much more organized, more intrusive.
Definitely. But then you have something like smallpox inoculation or modern flu vaccine distribution. That's biopower.
Does so.
Well, think about flu shots. With limited vaccine quantities, governments don't just randomly distribute them. They use calculative logic data about population density, risk factors like age or underlying health conditions to target the most vulnerable groups first.
To protect the overall population's health.
Exactly. This approach aims to foster life for the majority, but it also implicitly accepts some level of letting die. Maybe it's the statistical risk of vaccine side effects or the fact that not everyone can be vaccinated immediately. It serves the overall biological health of the population. It's a calculation.
That makes sense. We see this life-administering power in modern applications all the time, right? Using social science statistics to normalize, control, and regulate the life and health of populations.
Constantly. Public health campaigns, urban planning, insurance risk assessments.
And it even includes what Foucault called technologies of subjectification. That sounds pretty academic, but what does it really mean in practice?
It just means the ways modern society shapes our very sense of self, our identity, our desires. It's often not about forcing you into line through overt rules, but stimulating you to want to conform.
How does that work?
Think about the intense pressure, especially through media and advertising, to present a certain image, like the relentless message. Get undressed, but be slim, be good-looking, tanned.
Okay, so it's controlling us by shaping what we desire.
Exactly. It's power working not primarily through repression, don't do that, but through shaping what we aspire to be, what we consider normal or desirable. It guides our choices subtly.
That's a really interesting point, that control can come through stimulation rather than just prohibition. So bringing it all together, it's crucial to understand that biopower didn't just replace sovereign or disciplinary powers, did it? They didn't just become obsolete.
No, absolutely not. That's a common misunderstanding. Instead, Foucault argued they cooperated and continued to serve complementary roles.
They didn't render their predecessors redundant.
Not at all. Think of it as layers of power building on top of each other, interacting.
So you have these intertwined functions. You mentioned police earlier.
Right. Police, for example, are clearly disciplinary, controlling individuals, enforcing rules. But they're also regulatory instruments of biopower, helping to protect the biological existence of populations, managing traffic flow to prevent accidents, intervening in public health crises.
Okay, and mental asylums.
Same idea. They act as instruments of control over individuals, sure, and as regulatory institutions managing individual abnormalities for what's seen as the scientific protection of society. It's disciplinary and biopolitical. They play multiple roles at once.
And what's truly unsettling but really central to Foucault's point is how even sovereign power, that old power to kill, can be used to serve biopolitical goals.
Yes. This is where it gets very dark, but it's crucial. Take Nazi Germany as the most extreme example.
Okay.
The sovereign's power to kill, mass murder, genocide was employed for horrifying biopolitical objectives. The supposed protection of the biological properties of the German race.
By eliminating those deemed unworthy.
Exactly. Eliminating unworthy lives like Jews, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled. But notice, it even involved sacrificing their own people. German soldiers dying in the war for the larger objective of racial purity and the strength of the national body. Life itself, the biological life of the race, became the central political calculation, justifying extreme violence.
That's chilling. And in liberal regimes, it's obviously different, but you're saying a similar logic can apply, though thankfully not to that horrific extreme.
Foucault would argue yes, in a way. The sovereign's deadly force, think military intervention, capital punishment in some places, is often justified to protect the liberal subject and neutralize threats that are framed as posing a biological danger to the population or its way of life.
Like the war on terror.
That's a key example often analyzed through this lens. Interventions aimed at creating liberal spaces and achieving security were framed, in part, as protecting a certain kind of life by eliminating perceived biological or existential dangers, even if those dangers were sometimes abstract or ideological. It's still about managing life and death for the population.
Okay, so to wrap this part up, while biopower might be the dominant or constitutive force now, with its focus on managing and fostering life,
sovereign and disciplinary powers haven't disappeared. They act as supportive, punitive, and corrective mechanisms to essentially guarantee the circulation of biopower.
They prop it up, enforce its boundaries.
In a sense, yes. They all coexist in this complex web of social interactions, rather than simply replacing one another chronologically. It's a dynamic, intricate dance between these different forms of power.
Wow. What a journey through Foucault's insights. It really changes how you look at things. We've explored sovereign power with its ultimate right to take life or let live.
The power of the spectacle.
Then disciplinary power, which trains and corrects bodies and minds through surveillance and normalization, aiming for efficiency.
The power of the institution, the timetable, the norm.
And finally, biopower, which manages life itself at the population level, actively fostering it, calculating risks, and paradoxically, sometimes letting certain lives die for the perceived greater good of the whole.
The power over life itself.
And crucially, we've seen how these aren't isolated historical stages, but they intricately cooperate even today in modern Western societies, creating this complex web of influence that shapes us and our world.
Absolutely. And this deep dive into Foucault's work, it really leaves us with a truly provocative question, something for you to think about. If power isn't just a top-down command, if it's not something simply possessed,
but instead it's this pervasive, productive force that shapes how we see ourselves, what we consider normal, even our most intimate desires.
then how might understanding these subtle mechanisms, sovereign, disciplinary biopower, change the way you perceive the everyday forces influencing your own lives and choices? What kinds of awareness, or even what new forms of resistance, however small, might this understanding inspire in your own life?